Hello history lovers, and welcome back to the history you missed. In the heart of ancient Rome, where marble columns pierced the sky and the Colosseum cast its enormous shadow across the eternal city, stories of glory and brutality intertwined like threads in a blood-soaked tapestry. Today we journey into one of history's darkest corridors, a place where triumph and tragedy collided, where the fate of the vanquished hung by the thinnest of threads. To understand the fate of female prisoners in the aftermath of gladiatorial victories, we must first understand the Roman arena itself, that grand theater of death that dominated Roman entertainment for over 6 centuries. The Colosseum, completed in 80 AD under Emperor Titus, could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators. But it was merely the crown jewel in a network of amphitheaters that stretched from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to Syria. In every corner of the empire, the games were performed, and in every corner, prisoners of war awaited their fate. If you're coming across our videos for the very first time, kindly hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we bring you chilling history documentary that'll keep you glued to your seat. Before we dive deep, kindly tell us in the comments section where you're watching from. Thank you. When Roman legions returned victorious from campaign, they brought with them not just gold and territory, but human cargo, prisoners of war by the thousands. Men, women, and children alike were paraded through the streets during the triumph, that spectacular celebration of military conquest. Ancient historian Josephus documented one such triumph after the Jewish revolt, describing how thousands of prisoners were forced to march in chains while the crowds jeered and celebrated. But what happened after the spectacle? Where did these prisoners go? 4 male prisoners of suitable age and physique, the path was often clear. The gladiatorial schools, the ludi, where they would be trained to fight and die for Roman entertainment. But for women, the reality was far more complex and in many ways more harrowing. The legal erasure of human dignity. In Roman jurisprudence, prisoners of war occupied a peculiar legal category. The moment a person was captured by Roman forces, they experienced what was called capitis deminutio maxima, the total loss of legal personhood. They ceased to exist as legal entities under Roman law. This wasn't merely theoretical. It had devastating practical implications. Female prisoners lost all rights to property, to family relationships, to bodily autonomy. They became, in the eyes of the law, objects rather than subjects. This legal transformation enabled what followed, a systematic exploitation that took multiple forms. The jurist Gaius, writing in the 2nd century AD, explained that those captured in war became slaves by the law of nations, the ius gentium. Unlike criminals who retained some legal protections, prisoners of war had no recourse, no appeal, no protection beyond the whims of their captors. 4 female prisoners, several fates awaited. Some were sold directly into slavery at massive auctions held in the aftermath of conquest. The Roman writer Strabo described markets where thousands of slaves could be processed in a single day. Women deemed suitable for domestic service might find themselves working in the households of wealthy Romans. Others, particularly those who were young and considered attractive by Roman standards, faced a darker destiny, one that intersected directly with the world of gladiatorial combat. The popular imagination often portrays gladiators as noble warriors, and some achieved fame and even wealth. But the reality was far more brutal. Gladiators were, with rare exceptions, slaves themselves or condemned criminals. They lived in barracks that were part prison, part training facility. Archaeological excavations at Pompeii revealed such a facility, complete with tiny cells, shackles, and the skeletal remains of those who died there. Gladiators existed in a strange paradox. They were simultaneously among the lowest members of society and objects of public fascination. They were infames, legally disgraced, yet could become celebrities. Women of high status were rumored to have affairs with successful gladiators, scandals that Roman moralists condemned with fury. But what of the female prisoners who came into contact with these men? What happened when gladiators returned victorious from the arena? Historical sources provide fragmentary but disturbing evidence. The poet Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries AD, references in his satires the sexual exploitation that occurred in and around the arena. While his work is satirical and must be read with caution, it reflects social realities his audience would have recognized. Female prisoners, particularly those captured in recent campaigns, were sometimes kept near the gladiatorial schools. Their labor was exploited in multiple ways, as servants, as cooks, as cleaners for the facilities. But the historical record also indicates systematic sexual violence. A legal text from the Digest, a compilation of Roman law, casually mentions that female slaves in gladiatorial establishments could be used for the pleasure of the gladiators, as a reward for victory or good performance in training. This matter-of-fact statement, buried in legal commentary, reveals how normalized such exploitation had become. The Lanisti, the owners and managers of gladiatorial schools, had virtually unlimited power over their human property, and they used female prisoners as incentives, as rewards, as tools to maintain control over the gladiators themselves. The archaeology of suffering. Piecing together what happened to these women requires detective work across multiple disciplines. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence at gladiatorial sites throughout the empire. At a facility excavated in York, England, skeletal remains of women showed signs of trauma consistent with violence and exploitation. Chemical analysis of bones from similar sites suggests malnutrition and chronic stress. At a burial site near a Roman amphitheater in France, archaeologists uncovered the grave of a young woman, perhaps 20 years old. Analysis of her teeth indicated she came from North Africa. Her bones showed evidence of repeated fractures, consistent with physical abuse. She was buried quickly, without ceremony, in a common grave with other slaves. Chemical signatures in her bones revealed a diet consistent with the coarse grain fed to gladiators and others at the ludus. She had lived in or near a gladiatorial facility. She had suffered violence. She had died young. We will never know her name or the specific circumstances of her suffering, but the physical evidence tells a story of its own. A graffito scratched into a wall at Pompeii, preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, reads, "Celadus the Thracian makes the girls sigh." Celadus was a gladiator, apparently popular with women. But alongside such romantic graffiti, other inscriptions tell darker tales. Some reference women by the term ancilla, slave girl, in crude sexual terms connected to gladiators. These fragments of ancient gossip and boasting preserved in volcanic ash give us glimpses into a world where female slaves around the gladiatorial establishments were subjected to systematic sexual exploitation. Victory, power, and exploitation. In Roman culture, sexual violence against the conquered was not merely tolerated, it was expected, even celebrated as part of the victor's rights. When armies sacked cities, the systematic rape of women was standard practice. Ancient sources describe this with disturbing casualness. The Latin word preda, meaning booty or plunder, applied equally to material goods and to human beings. Women captured in war were considered prizes, property to be distributed among victors. This mindset extended from the battlefield to the arena. Gladiators who won in the arena were achieving a symbolic victory that echoed military conquest. The rewards they received, including access to female prisoners, reflected this parallel. Victory in the arena meant temporary escape from the crushing dehumanization of their own enslavement. 4 female prisoners, it meant confronting that same dehumanization from the other side. The philosopher Seneca, tutor to Emperor Nero, attended the games and left one of the few Roman accounts that expressed moral revulsion at what he witnessed. He described the midday executions, the periods between gladiatorial combats when prisoners were killed in various creative ways for entertainment. He mentions women among the condemned, though he turns away from describing their fate in detail. His reticence is itself telling. The Roman writer Tertullian, a Christian apologist writing around 200 AD, condemned the moral corruption of the games. He specifically mentioned the sexual exploitation of female prisoners as part of his broader critique of Roman entertainment. While his religious agenda colored his account, his descriptions align with evidence from other sources. The historian Dio Cassius, chronicling the excesses of Emperor Commodus, mentioned that the emperor's gladiatorial performances were followed by revelries involving captive women. Though the details are left vague, as they often were when Roman authors wrote of shameful subjects, the implication was clear. Women in the arena itself. Female prisoners appeared in the arena itself, though less frequently than their male counterparts. Roman games included various forms of execution and humiliation of prisoners, and women were not exempt from these horrors. Historical sources document several instances of women being forced to participate in arena spectacles. The historian Cassius Dio recorded that Emperor Domitian forced women to fight as gladiators, though whether these were prisoners of war or other condemned individuals isn't always clear in his account. Tertullian mentions women being forced to participate in mythological reenactments that involved sexual violence performed as public entertainment. In these spectacles, female prisoners might be forced to play the roles of mythological figures who were raped or abused in the stories. The author Martial, writing during the inauguration of the Colosseum, describes a spectacle in which a condemned woman was forced to play the role of Pasiphae, Queen of Crete, in a sexually explicit performance involving animals. While Martial's account may be exaggerated for shock value, such spectacles were documented in multiple sources. These public violations served a specific purpose in Roman ideology. They demonstrated Roman power over the conquered, they reinforced social hierarchies, and they provided entertainment that mixed sexuality with violence in ways that modern sensibilities find deeply disturbing. For gladiators who survived their bouts and sat in the barracks watching or hearing about such spectacles, the message was clear. Female prisoners were completely vulnerable, completely available, with no rights and no protection. Fragments of resistance and survival. Yet even in the depths of this systematic dehumanization, we find evidence of resistance, resilience, and survival. Some female prisoners found ways to mitigate their suffering. Ancient sources mention women who gained positions as servants in gladiatorial households, roles that, while still enslaved, offered some protection from the worst abuses. Others formed relationships, whether forced or negotiated, that provided some measure of security. The historical record preserves the name of one woman, Valeria, who appears in an inscription from the 3rd century AD. She is identified as the contubernalis, the partner of a retired gladiator named Marcus. While we cannot know the circumstances of how they met or whether the relationship began consensually, the fact that she was publicly acknowledged suggests she had achieved some status, some recognition as a person rather than merely property. Archaeological evidence also suggests that some women in gladiatorial communities formed support networks. At excavated sites, we find evidence of shared quarters, shared meals, shared religious practices. Even within the brutal system of slavery and exploitation, humans found ways to create connection and mutual support. This doesn't diminish the horror of what happened to them. But it reminds us that the victims of this system were not merely passive sufferers but active human beings who sought survival and dignity in impossible circumstances. The slow decline of blood sport. The gladiatorial games persisted for centuries, but they didn't remain unchanged. Over time, social attitudes began to shift, influenced partly by the spread of Christianity and partly by changing political and economic conditions. Early Christian writers condemned the games with increasing vehemence. While their primary concern was often theological, the association of the games with pagan religion, they also raised moral objections to the violence and sexual exploitation involved. Emperor Constantine, following his conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century, attempted to ban certain aspects of the games, though his reforms were inconsistently enforced. Later emperors made additional restrictions, though gladiatorial combat persisted in some form until the early 5th century. The last recorded gladiatorial combat in Rome occurred in 435 AD, under Emperor Valentinian III. By this point, the Western Roman Empire was in terminal decline, besieged by various migrant peoples and internal conflicts. The games had lost much of their cultural centrality. But the ending of the games didn't come from a sudden moral awakening about the treatment of prisoners of war or the exploitation of enslaved women. It came from economic exhaustion, political transformation, and the gradual influence of different cultural values. The victims of the system remained largely invisible even as the system itself faded. Remembering the forgotten. What does this dark chapter of Roman history mean for us today? Why excavate these uncomfortable truths from the buried past? First, it reminds us that the exploitation of prisoners of war, particularly sexual violence against female prisoners, is not a recent development. It has deep historical roots, and understanding this history helps us recognize the patterns when they emerge in modern conflicts. Second, it challenges our romanticized views of ancient Rome. The civilization that gave us magnificent architecture, sophisticated law, and influential literature also built systems of brutal exploitation. Historical greatness and historical horror can coexist in the same society. Third, this history illuminates the experiences of the nameless victims of empire. Most history focuses on the powerful, the emperors, the generals, the famous gladiators. But understanding the experiences of those without power, those whose suffering was considered too mundane to record, gives us a more complete and honest picture of the past. Modern scholars continue to uncover new evidence about these forgotten victims. Bioarchaeology, the analysis of ancient human remains, provides data about diet, disease, violence, and stress that can tell us about lives that left no written record. Digital humanities projects are using technology to analyze vast quantities of ancient texts, finding patterns and references that earlier scholars missed. The silence that speaks volumes. The ancient sources that survive were written almost exclusively by educated Roman men, members of the society that created and benefited from these systems. They wrote for audiences who shared their assumptions about power, slavery, and gender. When they mentioned female prisoners at all, it was usually in passing as background details to larger stories about important men. Recovering the experiences of these women requires reading between the lines, following archaeological traces, and listening to the silences in the historical record, asking what isn't said and why. The gladiators themselves were victims of a brutal system, enslaved or condemned to fight for others' entertainment. But their victimhood doesn't erase the suffering they inflicted on others, including female prisoners who had even less power and protection. This is the complexity of historical truth. There are layers of exploitation, chains of victimization, systems that dehumanize everyone caught within them while still maintaining hierarchies of suffering. As we remember the glory of Rome, its engineering marvels, its legal innovations, its cultural achievements, we must also remember these women, the ones who left no names, the ones whose suffering was considered too ordinary to record, the ones who were used and discarded by the machinery of empire. Their silence in the historical record is itself a testimony to their oppression. By acknowledging their existence, by attempting to understand their experience, we resist the erasure that their exploiters began and that historical amnesia continues. The Colosseum still stands in Rome, one of the most visited monuments in the world. Millions walk through its passages every year, imagining the spectacles that once filled it. Most will think of gladiators and glory, of epic combats and dramatic victories. Few will think of the women held in the structures nearby. Few will imagine the fear, the pain, the desperation of those who had lost everything, their homes, their families, their freedom, their dignity, and who faced exploitation and violence at the hands of those who had triumphed in Rome's blood-soaked arena. But they were there. They existed. They suffered. They matter. And their story, however fragmentary and painful, deserves to be told.